Welcome back to the deep dive. We're here to, wrestle with some really dense source material and pull out the clearest insights for you. Today we're diving into this massive intellectual clash. It's one that really still echoes today. The big face-off between reason, Greek philosophy style, and faith, as understood through revelation. We're heading back, way back to the Islamic Golden Age, 11th century. And we're meeting a true intellectual giant, Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali. Lived 1058 to 1111 CE. And he wasn't just like a participant in this debate. He basically wrote the book that drew the battle lines.
That's absolutely right. Our source material today, it's all centered on his huge work, Tahafut al-Falasifa. That translates to the Incoherence of the Philosophers. And this wasn't some minor academic paper, it was a really powerful, devastating critique. And it came from arguably the most influential Islamic scholar of that whole era.
Yeah, and the target, it wasn't small fry either. Al-Ghazali was aiming this squarely at the heavyweights, people who'd kind of merged Greek-thinking Aristotle, Neoplatonism with Islamic theology. We're talking figures like al-Farabi and maybe most importantly Avicenna, or Ibn Sina, as he's also known. These guys were the intellectual rock stars of their day. Their philosophy pretty much ruled the schools.
Oh, absolutely. You really have to grasp the context here. Avicenna wasn't just a philosopher. In many circles, he was the philosopher. He built these massive, incredibly complex systems, metaphysics, logic. So for al-Ghazali to challenge him, well, that wasn't just an academic disagreement. For some people, it was almost like intellectual treason.
Okay, so the mission for us in this deep dive is kind of two things, right? First, we need to get a handle on exactly what philosophical ideas al-Ghazali found so dangerous, so problematic, that he had to write this definitive smackdown. And second, we got to see how he did it, apparently using the philosopher's own tools against them.
Sure.
Okay, right, let's unpack this.
Okay, first off, the context. This is super important and often gets missed. Al-Ghazali wasn't, some kind of Luddite attacking philosophy because he didn't get it. No, not at all. Our sources are clear. He spent years really digging into the rational sciences, logic, philosophy itself. He knew Avicenna's work backwards and forwards.
Right. So he's not throwing out the baby with the bathwater. He wasn't rejecting thinking or intellectual work. He was more like an insider, who saw a specific danger point, a point where, like, pure reason, without any guidance, led to conclusions that just flat out contradicted what he saw as the absolute core truths from the Quran and the Sunnah.
Precisely. So his critique wasn't aimed at, say, mathematics or physics, not science or logic in themselves. It was aimed squarely at metaphysics. It was about philosophers trying to figure out divine truth, theological stuff using only human reason, stepping way beyond what he felt could actually be proven into territory he saw as just dangerous speculation.
And that's the whole point of the Tahafut al-Falasifa. It's this methodical takedown, trying to show the internal contradictions, the flaws in the logic that propped up these really threatening philosophical ideas. He apparently tackled 20 different issues, but there were three. Three that were so bad, he basically labeled them heresy. Said they could actually endanger a believer's soul.
Yes, those three are crucial.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, isn't it? Because these weren't just minor quibbles. They hit right at the absolute heart of Islamic belief about God, about creation itself. Let's start with that first one.
Right. The first major point of contention was the eternity of the world. Now, this idea, it came straight out of Greek thought Aristotle, the Neoplatonists.
Okay, but hold on. Why would a philosopher even want to argue the world is eternal? Wouldn't it just be simpler to say, okay, God made it at some point?
Well, not if you're working from their premises. Their logic was really tied up with the idea of God's absolute perfection, God's unchanging nature, immutability. See, if God is perfect, God can't change. So, if God decided to create the world, let's say, last Tuesday, well, that implies that before last Tuesday, God was different, maybe inactive, maybe not yet a creator. That implies change in God.
Ah, okay, so to keep God eternally perfect and necessary.
Exactly. They argued creation couldn't be an event in time. It had to be an eternal process, like an overflow, an emanation that has always existed alongside God. Therefore, the world itself, maybe not this specific chair or planet, but the underlying substance has to be co-eternal with God. It was, for them, a logical way to protect God's perfect unity.
That's some heavy philosophical lifting there. Yeah. But al-Ghazali, he must have seen this as just completely gutting God's power, right? God's will. If creation is just this necessary automatic overflow, where's the choice?
That's precisely it. For al-Ghazali, this turned God from this all-powerful chooser, this agent who wills things into being, into just a Well, a necessary, almost passive first cause, and that was a massive theological problem for him.
Okay, big clash number one. Let's move to the second point. This one feels even more personal, maybe. God's knowledge of particulars. The philosophers argued God only knows the big picture, like humanity or justice, these universal concepts, but not like the specific details, not whether I had toast for breakfast this morning.
Yeah, that's the gist of it. And again, the reasoning loops back to protecting God's unity and perfection. Think about particular specific things, individual choices, fleeting moments. They're constantly changing, right? And there's an infinite number of them. So if God's mind had to contain and track all these specific changing details, well, that introduces multiplicity, change, complexity into the divine essence itself, which they saw as impossible for a perfect, simple being.
So they were trying to keep God sort of pristine,
Yeah.
abstracted away from the messy, changing world by saying God doesn't know the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah.
Precisely. It's about maintaining that metaphysical principle. The divine mind has to be purely one, universal, unchanging, abstract.
But Al-Ghazali fires back, saying, hang on, if God doesn't know the particulars, God is basically ignorant of almost everything that actually happens. How can God judge specific actions justly, reward or punish individuals?
Yeah, that completely undermines the idea of an all-knowing, judging God, doesn't it? Wow. Okay, that's another huge gulf. The third point then, resurrection and the afterlife. This sounds more obviously religious, but I bet the philosophers had a sophisticated objection here too.
Oh, they did. It was quite systematic. Generally, they were okay with the idea of a spiritual afterlife. The soul survives, maybe faces some kind of judgment or consequence. But the physical resurrection, the idea that your actual body, the atoms scattered to the wind, could literally be put back together and then experience physical rewards or torments in heaven or hell, many philosophers saw that as, well, frankly, impossible according to the laws of nature as they understood them, or maybe just a metaphor, a story told to keep the ordinary folks in line, people who couldn't grasp purely spiritual consequences.
Right, a kind of noble line, maybe?
Perhaps. But Al-Ghazali's defense here was absolutely critical. He argued that denying the physical resurrection wasn't just arguing about details, it was fundamentally denying God's omnipotence, God's power.
Okay, his point was, if God created the entire universe from nothing, which Al-Ghazali firmly believed, then surely putting a body back together is like small potatoes for an all-powerful being.
Exactly. By saying physical resurrection is impossible, they were essentially putting limits on God, dictating what the Creator can and cannot do based on their understanding of nature.
And it's these 3 points, eternal world, God not knowing particulars, denying physical resurrection that Al-Ghazali labeled as incoherent, even heretical.
Yes, those were the big 3 where he drew the line most firmly. Okay, this brings us to a really crucial part. His method. How did he actually do this? Because we often hear this simplified idea that Al-Ghazali just rejected reason entirely, but we've already said that's wrong.
Right.
So what was his approach in the Tahafut?
Right, that misconception is key to clear up. He absolutely did not reject reason. What he rejected was the idea that human reason all by itself could be the ultimate judge of truth, especially divine truth. He affirmed logic, saw it as a vital tool for, math, science, everyday stuff. But when philosophers tried to use only logic to build these grand metaphysical systems about God and reality, without anchoring it in revelation, that's where he said it goes off the rails. His emphasis was clear. Reason is incredibly valuable, essential even. But it must be guided by divine revelation when dealing with ultimate questions.
Okay, so he wasn't just quoting scripture and saying case closed. How did he use their own methods, their logic against them? Can you give us an example of this, like intellectual judo move? Sure, a great example is how he tackled the eternity of the world. Remember the philosopher's argument. If God created the world at a specific time t, you have to ask, why t? Why not the moment before? Choosing a specific time seems arbitrary, and arbitrariness doesn't fit with a perfect, necessary God.
Right, that was their logical defense of eternity.
Okay, so Al-Ghazali flips it. He meticulously goes through their own arguments for eternity, arguments based on things like avoiding infinite regress and relying on necessary causes. And he shows that these arguments themselves are full of contradictions. They don't logically prove the world is eternal.
He pulls the rug out from under their logic.
Exactly. For instance, he argues that if the world were truly eternal, stretching infinitely into the past, you run into impossible paradoxes, like having to complete an actual infinite number of past events to reach the present moment. which is logically absurd. He used reason to show that reason alone, when applied to these ultimate cosmological questions, actually leads to dead ends, to paradoxes, to skepticism, not to the certainty the philosophers claimed. So, by showing these internal flaws in their proofs for eternity, he argued the only coherent way out was to accept the possibility revealed by faith of a God who has genuine will, a creator who can choose to create at a specific moment freely without being bound by the kinds of logical necessities we humans perceive in time.
So he wasn't just saying, you're wrong because the Quran said so. He was saying, your own arguments don't even hold up on their own terms. He showed their supposed rational certainty was actually just speculation, maybe even requiring its own kind of leap of faith.
That's precisely the method, using reason against what he saw as flawed or overreaching reason. It clarifies why the Tahafut was so incredibly powerful and, well, disruptive.
Okay, so zooming out now, what's the big picture impact? Why are we still talking about this book written over 900 years ago? What does it all mean?
Well, the immediate impact back then was huge. It really helped clarify the boundary intellectually between what philosophy could reliably achieve and what needed the guidance of revelation. It acted as this incredibly sophisticated defense, reassuring Muslim scholars and ordinary people alike that their faith was rational, it was robust, it could stand up to the most brilliant philosophical challenges of the day. It sort of shored up the intellectual foundations of orthodoxy.
And beyond the immediate Islamic world.
Oh, its influence spread much wider, longer term. Al-Ghazali's arguments profoundly shaped subsequent Islamic thought, often steering it more towards spiritual insight and revelation alongside reason. But crucially, his critiques also filtered into the Latin West. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, centuries later, were grappling with the very same questions Al-Ghazali raised about how you reconcile Aristotle, this powerful pagan philosophy, with monotheistic faith. Al-Ghazali kind of set the template for how theology could critically engage with philosophy rather than just dismissing it or blindly accepting it.
So the core takeaway really isn't that Al-Ghazali was anti-intellectual. Not at all. He was a master intellectual who was demanding maybe intellectual humility. He wasn't against thinking. He was against philosophical conclusions reached through what he saw as speculation running wild that ended up denying what he held as fundamental truths. Creation by a willful God, God's total awareness, the reality of the afterlife. He sort of wanted to redirect reason's energy, didn't he? Away from risky metaphysics, back towards things like ethics, law, understanding revelation.
That captures it perfectly. The enduring challenge of the Tahafut really is that call for discernment. To be able to tell the difference between genuine, grounded wisdom, maybe knowledge gained through reliable means, including revelation and philosophical speculation that, however clever it sounds, might just lead you into contradiction or denial of deeper truths.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with a pretty potent final thought to chew on, doesn't it? Al-Ghazali argued back then that pure reason, applied to the divine, ultimately ties itself in knots, becomes incoherent. Today, our world is saturated with knowledge driven purely by science, data, rationality. We're constantly pushing boundaries in understanding the universe, morality, even consciousness itself, often without reference to revelation. So if Al-Ghazali were here today, where would he draw the line? Where would he see the boundary between incredibly useful rational inquiry and what he might call incoherent speculation? Think about the tension between data and belief, reason and something perhaps beyond it. Where do those lines fall for you? Something to ponder. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.